Let's move on to panel, and I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest speakers or panelists. Right next to me, and from your side on the right hand, Sir John Major, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1990 and 1997, and senior advisor to Credit Suisse since 2001. Next to Sir John Major, Dr. Kumiharu Shigehara, the former Deputy Secretary General of the OECD and a former Chief Economist of Bank of Japan, and currently President of the International Economic Policy Studies Association. And the next to Dr. Shigehara, Mr. Ichiro Fujisaki, the former Ambassador of Japan to the United States of America, and currently Professor of Sophia University and Keio University, and President of America-Japan Society in Japan. For the panel, I actually decided to divide into two parts. The first part is to talk about domestic economic policy management, and second part is talking about the Japan's laws in Asia and the growth, and some geopolitical issues. So why not we kicking off the first part of the panel, and I'd like Dr. Shigehara first to share his view on the economic policy management. Dr. Shigehara was one of the top the BOJ official, but unlike the former Governor Shirokawa-san, Dr. Shigehara has been for some time quite proactive in advocating the necessity of aggressive monetary easing. Right now, he seems to be more interested in structural reforms in Japan, and I tend to think that Dr. Shigehara-san feels that the current Abenomics is somewhat in short in terms of the structural reforms. And he will compare, I presume, the Japan with Germany. So please elaborate your views on the current Japanese economic policy management, and we welcome your kind of critical view, actually. Please.
Thank you. Initially, I was asked to assess the pros and cons, if I may, of Abenomics. And we have just heard what Abe-san said. Well, I'll have an echo on that, and probably later I'll discuss the international dimension. And I was also asked to keep my intervention short and not to bother other people with a longer statement. I prepared my statement in 10 minutes, so you can just count on me on that, as far as the length is concerned, not perhaps the content. Now, back in 1997, Paul Samuelson, Nobel laureate in economics, wrote an article titled, "For Japan, a Message of Optimism," not pessimism, optimism. Now, I quote, "The 1990s have brought gloom to Japan. I've been critical of the passive acceptance by Japan of its continuing slump. A program of deregulation and privatization is a good thing for long-run efficiency and growth. But no nation ever cured a short-term recession or depression with such a program. What we needed is vigorous use of fiscal expansionism." That's the key word I would like to concentrate on. Now, it is not my present purpose to rehash these macroeconomic wisdoms. My present message is one of optimism, not one of despair. Japan workers still have the work ethic. Skills have not been rusted away. Class warfare and trade union bad feelings have not been spawned by its long stagnating economy. The odds favor substantial Japanese recovery, if not in 1997, but then in 1998. Now, in July 1997, just a month after Samuelson published this message of optimism on Japan's future, a financial crisis broke out in Thailand. The crisis soon spread to Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Korea. They saw their currencies depreciated substantially against the US dollar and the Japanese yen. The contraction of domestic demand in these Asian economies and the yen appreciation weakened Japanese exports. A series of expansionary fiscal measures were introduced in Japan in vain to reflate the domestic economy and turn its fiscal position into the worst among advanced economies. Rather than following Samuelson, who called for more aggressive fiscal expansion in Japan, I, as OECD chief economist, stressed the importance of aggressive monetary policy and exchange rate management at confidential meetings of high officials of finance ministries and central banks of a group of 10 rich OECD countries. Now, there I argued that an effective way to jumpstart the economy after the burst of a bubble is aggressive easing of domestic monetary conditions to ward off deflationary spiral. Some prominent US and European economists, including Joseph Stiglitz and Lars Svensson, expressed similar opinions at some point in time. After leaving the OECD in 1999, I started to argue openly for a global solution needed to deal with the so-called Japan problem, no longer shackled by institutional constraints that have been imposed on me during my tenure of office as an international civil servant. In 2003, I wrote an article in Financial Times to propose a 10-point program that included a call for Bank Japan, aggressive monetary policy easing, and government action in the foreign exchange market, as well as a new regional mechanism for currency stabilization in East Asia. Immediately after the outbreak of the global financial crisis in 2008, I once again started to argue openly that Bank Japan must act more aggressively. This policy advice on monetary activism did not find favor within the monetary authorities at the time. Yet, it is essentially the monetary policy component of the so-called Abenomics announced by Shinzo Abe in December 2012 general election, then leader of the opposition Democratic Party. His victory in the election enabled him to come back as Prime Minister of Japan for his second term. Now, despite Samuelson's note of optimism, Japan's continued economic sluggish growth resulted in its decline in global league tables for citizens' living standards. In fact, Japan's per capita income, measured by purchasing power parity, declined to about 70% of the US level in 2013, while it was about 80% of the US level in 1990. Compared with Britain and France, Japan's per capita income was higher in 1990, but in 2013, it stood at about the same level. Now, what is striking is the economic performance of Germany over recent years. Germany was not hit by the collapse of asset market prices as Japan was, but between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Germany was often called the sick man of Europe. Both in 1990 and in 2000, Germany's per capita income stood at virtually the same level as Japan's. However, by 2013, it was some 20% above the levels of Japan, Britain, and France, rising to 84% of the US level. Now, in my view, Germany's better performance essentially reflects more solid economic growth driven by strong exports that have been supported by the European common currency mechanism. And indeed, one lesson for Japan I would draw from the German experience is the importance of a regional mechanism for exchange rate stability in a well-integrated trade area. And in fact, it is one component of the 10-point package deal I proposed in my Financial Times article of early 2003. But even now, such a mechanism does not exist in Asia, nor is it considered as a goal to be achieved at in the so-called Abenomics. Let me now turn to the issue where I think policy activism is required most urgently in Japan. The three arrows of Abenomics are aggressive monetary policy easing, fiscal stimulus, and thirdly, structural reforms. Now, I've already touched on the first arrow. On the whole, this arrow appears to be getting closer to its target. On the second arrow of flexible fiscal policy, I would argue that further fiscal stimulus cannot be used as a policy tool to revive overall economic growth in a sustainable manner. In 2014, Japan's general government gross debt amounted to 226% of GDP, the highest ever recorded in the OECD area. In the OECD analysis on long-term growth prospect and fiscal requirements, Japan's general government gross debt is projected to amount to 252% of GDP in 2030. Now, OECD model simulation exercise showed that its public debt ratio would decline to nearly 100% of GDP by 2040 if, that's an important if, potential real GDP growth were raised from 1 to 2% at an annual average rate, while inflation were kept at the 2% target rate. This highlights the importance, and in fact, crucial importance of the third arrow of Abenomics, namely structural reform to enhance economic growth potential. The Japanese government announced Japan revitalization strategy, but in my view, measures so far taken or announced are inadequate, and the Abe government should be more ambitious. First, we must cope with the labor supply problem associated with population aging by boosting the participation of women and older people. Second, we must accelerate Japan's integration in the world economy through trade agreements, notably the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement. And third, we must further improve the business climate by upgrading corporate governance, promoting venture capital investment, and redesigning policies for the small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, how can the Japanese government embark on such an undertaking? Now, this is a really important political issue. Now, on the we just talked about a bit of the Asian crisis. In fact, in a number of Asian countries, including Korea, that were hit by the Asian financial crisis, labor market and other structural reforms were included as important components of receiving financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. On the other hand, Japan did not resort to external assistance to deal with shocks associated with the burst of asset market prices in the early 1990s. The situation in Germany was the same in this respect. No forceful outside guidance was exercised for structural reform. The so-called Hartz reform to the German labor market, implemented under Gerhard Schröder government in 2003, is often credited for the successful restructuring of the economy. But in fact, the process of wage decentralization and improvement in competitiveness had been begun in Germany nearly a decade before the Hartz reform were implemented. In his June 1997 article, Samuelson wrote, I quote, "Japan's continued stagnation has involved massive waste of potential production, but Japan has not yet been hurt in the way that their countenancing of double-digit inflation, unemployment rate has hurt Germany or France." End of quote. Since Samuelson's article was published, Germany has undergone such structural reforms which are far more significant than in France, This reflects differences between the two countries in a system of industrial relations. Faced with economic stress, the German system, intrinsically more flexible than a highly centralized French system, allowed decentralization of wage determination from the level of industries to the level of single firm or single workers. And this review raises an important political economy issue involved in structural reform in Japan. Can the Japanese government, business firms, and labor market institutions spontaneously engage themselves in a fundamental reforms before experiencing such a critical labor market situation as in Germany? Another important policy issue is the societal consequences of labor market flexibility. In Japan, there is growing concern about the rise in income inequality and relative poverty. Labor market dualism is its major cause. The precarious situation of non-regular workers with low income discourages the marriages and hence reduces the fertility rate with negative social and economic consequences. The Japanese government should make efforts to break down dualism by reducing factors that encourage firms to hire non-regular workers. To be fair, I should hasten to add that despite increases in inequality, Japan ranks at the top in personal security among OECD countries and performs well in many other dimensions of citizens' well-being. And the result of international tests on children, educational attainments, and adult skills invariably show excellent marks for Japan. But there are reasons to argue that Japanese government should address the issue of growing anomalies in income distribution and increasing relative poverty as a matter of top priority, which has not been addressed, in my view, by Abe government yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Shigehara. So your take of the Abenomics is such that the facile aggressive monetary easing is working, but in the meantime, the third allo structural reforms are still more as a disappointment. And you also talked about the Korea IMF kind of issue in comparison with Germany. But what is your main take of the, in terms of the biggest obstacle for the structural reforms in Japan? What is your view on that?
Well, I think there are similar factors working not just in Japan but elsewhere, particularly in the organized system they do have, like in France. The labor industrial relations is highly centralized and protect the vested interest of regular workers. More fundamentally, when we think of agricultural reform, not in my country alone, but say, again, France, which is one of the countries I love, that this is a fundamental problem in democracy, in my view, because voters are short-sighted, right? And politicians, to be re-elected, must please them. So they really must be concerned about short-term benefits relative to short-term cost and the long-run benefits and cost. Now, the vocal voice resistance basically comes from vested interest groups in agriculture, from small industry, inefficient, not viable under free market conditions. And this tended to really delay productivity growth. This is the political reality. Now, there are several, of course, external forces which could, in theory, work to address this issue. What is that? Well, first, surveillance. Now, in the case of Japan, we are not subjected to regional surveillance like in EU countries, but we do have multilateral surveillance by the IMF and the OECD. The latter is more really stronger than the IMF in terms of structural policies, because IMF is basically, as you know well, dominated by finance ministries and central banks, and the executive board is composed of people sent to Washington from the finance ministry or central bank. They don't have any really knowledge about how to deal with structural reform with such consequences on the social dimension. So they are really incompetent. They can write something good, but in terms of persuading policymakers or policy advisors, it won't work. Now, there's a merit in the OECD system because basically policy advisors, very senior people, deputy ministry people and so forth, gather in Paris and have peer pressure to work on it. Nevertheless, when it comes to this hardcore of structural reform, surveillance by the OECD, with which I'm, of course, quite experienced, has not really reached its aim. Now, how about EU? Now, Germany, do you think that EU played a major role in structural reform? No. Why has France continued to resist all these advices coming from the OECD and the EU? The same. So what is that then? How to, well, change the public opinion? And there, well, I think we cannot really have lots of optimism. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that we should resign ourselves in this current situation. My own view is that we should try to persuade the general public. By all means we have. I belong to the OECD. I send messages of this sort, meeting with the politicians. And the same thing, I think, with respect to other countries' structural reform. Finally, something else can happen, potentially. Now we have G7 exercise and G20 exercise, which is really at the level of politicians. But again, there's a weak point. There's no permanent secretariat, no independence. It's run by the hosting country each year. There's no institutional memory. How can they have analytical capacity to say, hey, Mr. Obama, your social security reform is good. You have quite a lot to do with income inequality. This also have the generational transfer of poverty through bad education system. All these are related. But I am rather pessimistic, but I would like to have the views of Sir John on this matter.
Yeah, actually, you know, I think that Dr. Shigehara has a question to John, but I think Sir John, but I think before going to that, already Dr. Shigehara raised the issue of the difficulty of structural reform. So, what is your current, I think, assessment of the Abenomics in terms of the structural reforms, or third other we call? Is there any? Have you seen any changes happening in this country, or from your viewpoint? What is your take?
Well, several things really. If I could pick up a couple of points just for 1 second that Dr. Shigehara made. Germany's export boom really has two component factors. One, the first component factor is that when they entered the euro, they did so on extremely favorable rates compared to the rest of the European economies. And secondly, their exports were to a large extent to European economies that had just had their interest rates reduced from 8 to 10% to 2%, who actually bought German exports they couldn't really afford. And this has given a huge boost to German exports over the past 10 years of the Eurozone, with consequential damage to Southern Europe as well. So it has had an inverse effect in parts of Europe. The second point I would just make, you mentioned the German supply-side reforms in the early part, in the Schroeder government. They were very similar in many ways, the direction of travel rather than the detailed policies to those made by the Thatcher government in the 1980s. And they were extremely difficult to do, and this is relevant to Japan. They were extremely difficult to introduce. That we could introduce them in the 1980s because we had inherited an economy on its knees. This is traditional after a Labour government in the UK. We inherited an economy on its knees, and the public were prepared to accept policies that they wouldn't normally have accepted in a democratic society. And so we were extremely fortunate in terms of being able to do that. And of course, in Japan, you have a similar difficulty that many of the supply-side reforms are very uncomfortable to make. I can observe only from a distance, but as someone who is very fond of Japan and comes here quite regularly, it does seem to me there is a different attitude in Japan at the moment, an attitude that people can do things, whereas before there was a certain amount of hand-wringing and it was felt it wasn't possible to do it. You see it not only in economic policy, but the extent to which Japan is actually looking outward in a way I haven't seen her do for a very long time in terms of foreign policy, and I think that is very encouraging. I entirely agree with what Dr. Shigehara has said about arrows 1 and 2. The third arrow, structural reform, is clearly going to be the key to what happens. And that comes in many packets. There are bits of it that are bound to be uncomfortable and unpopular, and Mr. Abe will need all his banked up majority in both houses and popularity to see them through. But there are other areas of supply side reform which are as much social as economic, and I have in mind expanding the workforce, expanding the female half of the workforce, which is an important supply side reform, which I think Japan would benefit from both socially and economically. And I think it is too early to say how successful the Abe government will be with these structural reforms. They are setting out what looks to me like a very profound and worthwhile case. I can only say from my own experience in the 80s and from observing Germany in the early part of the centuries, implementation is a good deal more difficult than preparation. And so I think it's a little early to say how far the structural reforms will go, but I think they are absolutely the right thing to do. And I hope the Abe government can concentrate on some of the supply side reforms, like, for example, expanding the female workforce, which may buy him a degree of support in the more unpopular parts of supply side reform that will also be necessary. Just one final point. I think Japan does have this huge structural debt, of course, but unlike many of the European countries, the majority of its debt is owed internally rather than externally, which I think does make a material difference.
Yes, that's right.
Good,
Thank you, Fajan. On the point of the second element, called the fiscal policy management, I think the Dr. Shigehara has a question to be asked to Sajan.
Well, I started by quoting Samuelson, who argued for fiscal activism in Japan, and I said that was not what I would argue for my country. And I feel the same thing for Germany in the current context of the European crisis. But I would like to come back to your own country with the remarkable success of the Conservative Party. Well, polls didn't show that kind of prediction, but anyway, it was a surprise, and good surprise to me as well. And Mr. Bourne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was really the key person. But I recall that Paul Krugman and other US economists of Keynesian type argued that his policy would lead to disaster. Actually, the OECD forecast for economic growth for this year, well, UK stands out the first among G7 countries, and unemployment is gradually declining. So I think on the whole that's good. But the question I have for Sir John is that how do you think that Germany should run fiscal policy again? American economists of Keynesian type, Paul Krugman in particular, argue that Germany should act on fiscal policy as a source of economic growth in the zone. And I would like to hear your view on that. And secondly, on income inequality and poverty rates. Well, under Thatcher government, of course, you had a key person, and a lot has been done to make the economy more flexible. I don't say that this is quite related to the rise in inequality, but it is a worldwide phenomenon. Most remarkable among the OECD countries in the United States, Israel, say Turkey, Mexico. The Secretary General is from Mexico, but anyway, that's it. And I just wondered, how do you think the seriousness of rising inequality in almost all OECD countries, and also in emerging market economy, doesn't that lead to social tension with some consequences on the military front and so forth? This part will be discussed, I think, in the second part, but I'd just like to hear on this point briefly, if I may.
I will be brief. I mean, on on Germany and Krugman. I think Krugman was absolutely wrong as far as the UK are concerned, 100% wrong as far as the UK was concerned. But I agree with him about Germany. And I agree with him about Germany because the way the European Union operated from the outset, as it brought in the less well economic developed nations, was that there was a very large cross-transfer of funding from rich Northern Europe to less rich and sometimes quite poor Southern Europe. And that has dried up. Germany has done extraordinarily well out of the Eurozone. And there are many component reasons. It's never clear-cut here. But I do think it is going to take a very long time to get Southern Europe out of the mire in which it now is. It will get out. It is getting out, but very, very slowly, unless it is going to get more help from the North. Now, whether that is necessarily in a direct transfer of funds or in some other supply-side measure, I think is open to argument. But I do think the sooner the Northern Europe can help Southern Europe out of its hole, the sooner the Euro, and particularly the Eurozone, will perform better. So I have some sympathy for the Krugman argument in the Eurozone. I have no sympathy for it in the UK, where he was undoubtedly wrong.
Thank you.
As far as inequality is concerned, you actually very neatly provided a précis of speeches I have myself made over the last 12 to 18 months in the UK. A whole series of things are coming together in many countries. The nature of the global economy is driving people with the right skills to a higher level of income. And people with the wrong skills, even though they may be educated and willing to work, are falling further behind. And that is a problem in my country, as well as in many other countries as well. And I think it is one that has to be addressed. You kindly mentioned that the United Kingdom now has a much better growth rate than most other European countries, all of them at this present moment, though Spain is challenging them, may even have passed them by now. But we also have within the United Kingdom 3 or 4 areas that unbelievably are among the poorest in terms of income anywhere in Europe. Now that cannot be right. And the whole essence of what the second Cameron government is seeking to do, they have 2 embraced names, one a very old one, One Nation Conservatism, and another to develop a northern powerhouse. What they're really about is trying to spread the wealth of London and the southeast to a further degree to the less well-off parts of the United Kingdom. Some of that can be done by government. In the longer term, it's only going to be done by a good deal more vocational training. Frankly, we need as many vocational universities as we need academic universities if we don't wish to continue to import engineers, surveyors, plumbers, and all sorts of manual skills. So a great deal of this is very long term and will have to do with training and education. But it also has to do with infrastructure. One of the reasons the west of our country is so poor is there's very little access to it. Surprisingly, it's surprisingly difficult to get there. It takes a very long time. It's very inconvenient. And we actually need a much better infrastructure if we're to get investment into those underinvested parts of the UK. And in this, you can draw an analogy with India, which is only going to achieve its growth rates if it actually spends huge sums of money on infrastructure in India. So I think all those are component parts. There's no single silver bullet to stop this problem of inequality. But unless we stop it, there will, in country after country, be a rising level of political and social discontent. So it should be a crucial part of policy in my country and in many others.
Thank you. Quite illuminating.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sajam. So, Mr. Fustak, you have one
Yes,
question?
this is not a question, it's an observation. So neither Sir John nor Dr. Shigehara needs to answer my point. You see, the present-day leaders often say that before him or her, it's dark ages, nothing good. I'm not talking about Sir John. He didn't say that, but often the leaders would say, I think in Japan, often people say lost 2 decades, but I wonder if that was really the case. From 2003 to 2007, average GDP growth was 1.9%, 5 years. And at the same time, EU average was 2.1%. It was not that different. However, what happened in 2008, September, Lehman shock, that hit Japan most. And our industrial output went down by 22%, export went down by 33%, GDP went down by 5.5%. That's 50-year low. And then we started to pick up again, 2010. GDP growth was 4%, exceeding America or EU. Then, 2011, we were hit by earthquake, tsunami. I'm not trying to say that attribute everything to external causes, but all in all, we have to take those into account. And say, if we say that everything happening before was so bad, if everything is now happening good, it's a little bit of exaggeration. I'm not, I don't know.
So you mean that Prime Minister Abe is lucky?
No, I'm not saying he's lucky, but I'm not saying that, for example, all those before, like Koizumi-san or Aso-san, or those days were that bad too. So it's not, I know that in 90s it was rather messy, but beginning of 2000s, we were picking up, so, but we were a little unlucky as well. I hope
Yes.
Abe-san will continue to be lucky, yes. So it's an observation.
Any
So.
comments? Shigeru?
Well, only that Prime Minister Abe can't denounce his predecessors. He was one of them.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, we'd like to actually move on to the second part, and then we'd like to do a kind of Q&A. And second part is to talk about the Japan's laws in Asia and growth and a bit of the geopolitical issues. Mr. Fujisaki should have a lot those things to do to say, but again, I think Dr. Shigehara is making some kickoff on this,
My role
this issue,
again is to
and to
set
give
the
some
stage.
background for maybe Mr. Fujisaki to follow.
If I may, economist background, I would like to kick off this part of the discussion. Now, once again, I pick up Samuelson. Now, the rise of China was the topic he picked up in his June 1997 article. Again, I quote, "Now that the Soviet Union had collapsed, it is mainland China that is occupying people's mind. We read headlines about more than 10% growth rates in mainland China. However, China's level, this is per capita living standard, is only about 1/6 that of Japan. It'll be a long time until China's entire population comes anywhere near its present military might." According to the latest IMF statistics, China reached 16.3% of the world purchasing power adjusted GDP last year, surpassing the United States, which made slightly less, 16.1%. The IMF estimate for 2020 is that China's share of world total GDP will rise to 18.9%, nearly 19%. And the US share will decline to 15%, sorry. And for the same year, India's share is estimated to rise to 8.5%, compared with Japan's 3.7% and Germany's 3.0%. Now, concomitant to China's growing economic power, its increasing military strength has given rise to concern, not just in its neighboring countries, including Japan and the United States with a military presence in Asia, but concern is expressed also in Europe. At the War and Peace Seminar held in Barcelona last year at the invitation of Xavier Solana, former NATO Secretary General, he stated that the world economic center of gravity is moving to Asia. Peace and prosperity in East Asia is without any doubt one of the most important issues the international community must face. Solana then pointed out that economic prosperity is assured in East Asia, but we cannot say the same on the security field. As an invited speaker, I argue that economic integration in East Asia has been driven essentially by market forces that rely on long-term structural complementarities in key industrial sectors, resulting in strengthened interdependent trade flows and transfer in technology. Deepening of the understanding among East Asian political leaders and peoples about mutual benefits from economic interdependence should reduce the risk of a building of tensions resulting in armed conflicts among East Asian countries. And that said, I also noted that the process of EU integration that was promoted and deepened by conscious efforts of political leaders with the general support of electorate institutional framework for regional economic, financial, and monetary cooperation remain far less developed in East Asia. This is matched by the lack of mechanism to deal with any security crisis that might erupt as a result of territorial and other international conflicts. Indeed, the regional collective security system has historically been absent in East Asia and is currently still missing. And in this context, concern was expressed about internal sources of instability in China. One China expert at the seminar noted that Communist Party of China might be facing the most serious legitimacy crisis since 1949. According to him, corruption, economic slowdown, and a demographic crisis are the three most serious issues China must face. There's the danger that faced with such internal issues, the Chinese leadership might intend to divert the general public's attention to external issues to try to foster extreme nationalism to secure national unity. In such a situation, the lack of mechanism in East Asia for security may increase the likelihood of an accident leading to major military conflicts. At the seminar, Australian ambassador to Spain suggested the need to consider a wider region and explore the conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific basin instead of a narrower East Asian framework. I stress the importance of including India in the general scheme of Asia's economic integration and geopolitical stability. Now, this year marks the 70th anniversary of Japan's defeat and surrender to the Allied forces that end the Asia-Pacific War. Just a month ago, the strong ties between Japan and the United States were demonstrated by Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in his rather, in my view, emotive speech at the US Congress. I personally hope the statement he intends to make on the 70th anniversary of the war ends will include key messages for strengthening Japan's friendly ties, not just with the United States, but also with China, Korea, and other countries in Asia and Oceania, as well as the rest of the world, both in bilateral and multilateral framework. Japan's enhanced international cooperation, particularly with China, can bring about benefit not just the two countries, but given the size of the two Asian economic powers, it can have significant beneficial impacts on the economic prosperity and peace of the world as a whole. In this context, Japan should positively consider the participation in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Japan Investment Bank, which is proposed by China. I think your country has already shown the intention to join it. So I just stop here to set the stage.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Shigehara. So you sounded fairly concerned about the regional stability or security issues. Mr. Fujisaki, do you agree with Shigehara-san's view?
I agree that China is facing a very difficult issue, the legitimacy question. And the very essence of that is not corruption, it's discrepancy. 30 years ago, everyone was saying And under communist government, one-party rule, so much discrepancy between haves and have-nots, which promise that everyone should be equal. So that's I think, the most difficult issue. And for that, I think very clever leaders are targeting to two things. As you said, external issues and also corruption. So saying that these individuals are wrong, it's not the whole system itself. Very clever, I think, strategy. That's point one. Point two, now China is increasing its military expenditure and also having issues in South China Sea. I think it's a very clever policy again of China to grab islands on your right hand and offer money in left hand to Asian countries. I think 3,000 years of wisdom. Now, so I think I have a little different view on AIIB issue than Shigehara-san. I think because of three reasons. One, we have to be sure of governance. And some people would say, why don't you go in and try to change it? And if not, if it doesn't work, you should get out. But in view of our relations, once we get in, I don't think there's real option of getting out. That's point one. Point two, we have to be hand in hand with the United States. That's the most important part of partnership, because US is saying that, as we have learned so many times, Senkaku is covered by Article 5 of Security Arrangement. We cannot abandon US and go run to AIIB. The third most important reason is that now I think everyone is watching how Japan will be behaving on this issue. Shall we be running towards the bus, or shall we take a little more time and really, I think in diplomacy, which I think we have learned a lot from United Kingdom, it's very important, the image, and I don't think we should run at this time. Third, as US engagement in this region is so important, it's not only for China, but for North Korea and other reasons. And they are trying to engage more. For example, President Obama said, as I said, Senkaku is covered by Article 5 of US Security Arrangement. The first time was April 2014. Never a US president said that before. So we really appreciate that. And also, we have to really make it sure that they will do so. So we have to do something we can do. And what I think I like to stress is guidelines or security legislature that we are discussing is, in my view, the change is exaggerated. I think it's in line with Japan's Conservative Party policy. The same direction in trying to fortify US-Japan relations. It's the same direction, but taking more quicker steps, large steps. That's the difference, because as you follow the debate in Diet, Prime Minister and other ministers are saying what they will do on top of what we have been doing is what is thinkable is sweeping mines in Hormuz. That's the only thing that is something new. And it's not that Japanese self-defense forces going all over the world and start fighting or anything. That's sort of image, I think, little exaggerated, not only because of our Chinese-Korean friends, but our media, and also I think it's Abe-san and his cabinet is partly responsible, because in the beginning they wanted to show that it's a very new world. So I'm sorry to take a long time, but I wanted to explain this a bit. Thank you very much.
Well, I have to say that maybe Sir John and Dr. Shigehara may want to say or add to Mr. Fujisaki, but time has been running out, and sort of to say, but we're going to cut here for the panelists' comments, and I'd like to take our questions from the floor or the audience about geopolitics or economy and any matters. And please, if you have questions, please say that question to whom? To Fujisaki-san or Dr. Shigehara or Sir John? So please.
Or to Shirakawa-san.
Not me.
We'll refer to you.
Perhaps I could just put this slightly bluntly. I mean, the Pacific Ocean has been an American lake since the Second World War, and that has served all of us around the world, I think, very well in terms of security. But, but China, 20 years ago, its military expenditure was negligible, more or less, compared to the US. It is now 25% of US military spending, and within another 10, 15 years, could easily be 50%. So the situation is just fundamentally different. And yet I think I had a little bit of a sense from the panel that, in a sense, they want the old situation to continue, which is understandable given how well it is served. But I think, given the numbers I've just presented, I don't see how it can continue.
So, Mr. Fujisaki, what is your view on this China's expansion of the military expenditure? And
I would like to ask if Soviet Union was expanding its military expenditure, and if its GDP was growing, it's not the case. Would you be saying the same thing, that because Soviet Union, one-party communist country, is expanding that much, we have to be realistic and try to cooperate more with them? I don't think that was the case. And I think you try to compete with them through SDI and others, and the one-party system of that country changed at the and so I don't think that, I'm not trying to suggest that we should change the Chinese regime, but just because they are growing rapidly, that doesn't mean that they can change the rules. I think what's most important is the rules here, international norms, rules, and we would like them. Of course, if they come in, we should adjust, but they should first try to listen to international law of the sea and other established rules as well. That's my view, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please.
I'd like to ask the panel regarding the Japan energy policy now. With the oil prices going down, and of course energy is part of the economic development. Would you go back to nuclear energy? That's my first question. Second question would be, I think the previous speaker was talking about importance of engagement of ASEAN countries for trade and economics from Japan to have the sustainability of Japan economic development. How do you see the challenges of China, because China is also very aggressive in terms of reaching economic assistance or development towards the ASEAN country? Thank you.
Dr. Shigehara?
Okay, on the first issue, I'm not an energy expert, but given my own experience as a poor child right after the end of the war, I'm one of those who argue that we should be getting out of dependence on nuclear energy at any cost, because this is a country where earthquake and everything of this kind cannot be really controlled by human efforts. And one of my kindergarten classmates, who was the advocates of importance of getting out of dependence on nuclear years ago. He died of cancer not because of that, but anyway, he spent quite an energy, really throwing out his own fortune to claim that another kindergarten classmate, who was the vice minister of Minister of Industry and Trade, who argued for the use of physical energy in the short run, again, interest of industries with the very low cost of electricity and so forth. I think we should not be myopic. So we should really bear the decline in living standard to that extent. I think he has a point.
Thank you very much. You see, before the earthquake, our dependency, electricity's dependency was 26%, and we were aiming to go to 52% by 2030. But now we stopped everything and just restarted too. And this government, Abe-san's government, is restarting some of them so that we could continue nuclear. And I think Japanese consensus is that, well, there's no consensus, but majority view is that for the time being, we need some nuclear. Maybe not for the centuries, but because we lack so much. And because of the low oil price, our economy is good, but if it goes up again, I think it's going to be a very difficult. We are now enjoying this Abenomics, but it's because of low oil price as well. So we have to use some atomic energy, nuclear energy, but at the same time, I think Japan, as Shigehara-san said, has lots of volcanoes. So geothermal energy, I think, is promising. The only reason, one of the reasons that we are not able to use, we haven't been able to use, is because many of the sources are in national parks, and we cannot really use, we could not have used the geothermal, and its initial investment was too high. But I think we have to relook at that as well. Thank you.
On your second point about the implication of population aging in China, that is one of the very, very crucial issues which could really destabilize the foundation of China's system, because they don't have a well-developed security pension scheme, healthcare system, and so forth. And then when I was the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, I was the initiator of the OECD study on economic and policy dimensions of population aging and how to deal with that. And in fact, China is getting into more serious problem because of one baby policy. And how can you secure the lives of those aged people in agricultural areas? And this could give rise to instability internally, and again, as I said, logic could be to try to find scapegoat elsewhere in military area. So I think one of the things I would argue that Japan must cooperate in this area, because we have good experience having the longest life expectancy and well-advanced social security, healthcare system, and having also, anyway, the same sort of civilization. So there are lots to be said about the role of fathers, mothers, children, and so forth. In my view, this is a potential area for cooperation between the two countries.
Sergeant, your kind of final remarks, if you may.
Well, I think it would be impertinent to me to intervene too much in the Japanese concern over nuclear energy. I think I've learned enough in politics to know when to keep my mouth shut. But outside of Japan, where I understand the particular circumstances of 2011 and the impact on public opinion, and also the earthquake problem. So if I can put Japan to one side, I do think it is right for the rest of the world, the United Kingdom and others, to develop a nuclear capacity. And oddly, France, which is a back marker in so many things in Europe, is the leader in the development of nuclear energy. It has a great deal of nuclear energy. Indeed, it's beginning to own a certain amount of the UK's nuclear energy, since our market is a good deal more open than the French and the Germans. So I think generally nuclear energy is necessary when one takes a long-term look at energy needs of the nation. But I understand absolutely the reservations here in Japan. If I could just say a word about China, to add one or two things to what has been said. There may be a medium to long-term crisis in communist rule in China, but I don't think it's too immediate. Too many people have had their living standards rising, and there is too much of a cultural belief in the government for, I think, there to be anything dramatic in the short or medium term. But this corruption probe is very interesting. It's very interesting on several levels. Firstly, it is undoubtedly right to do it. Secondly, it's undoubtedly very smart to do it for the reasons that was stated a few moments ago. But thirdly, it seems to me to be quite targeted. It seems quite targeted in a way that reinforces President Xi's hold in power, in that it is often directed towards people and organizations that are not particularly supportive of him. Shanghai, for example, is facing particular difficulties at the moment because of the corruption probe. So I think that is an indication of how he is entrenching his power to a greater extent, perhaps, than any Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping quite a few years ago, and I think it is extremely smart. As to their military expenditure, I don't think we can be surprised or too shocked that a nation that has grown as much as this had, I pick up Giles's point, is expanding its military expenditure, particularly naval expenditure. Here's a country with a huge coastal area, also worried about its energy security, most of which is imported. And I would be rather surprised, frankly, if we were Chinese, we would be expanding our naval power. The question is she going to behave in an aggressive or a defensive posture in the future? And that is unknown, though there are odd areas like the Spratly Islands where one might begin to get a little bit worried. But by and large, I wouldn't be too worried about it at the moment. But it does emphasize one other point. I think China is moving into the community of nations. I hope, for example, the renminbi is going down. It's a technical point, is going to be part of the special drawing rights fairly soon. I hope before too long it's going to be a convertible currency. It's certainly used in overseas trade a great deal. All that draws China further into the international community. And it is partly for that reason that I personally would welcome it if Japan did join the AIIB. I think it would be a good thing. Britain has. I think it's America's fault if they don't like it, frankly, the way they behaved in the past. And I would quite like to see Japan join the bank. I think they'd be a stabilizing influence. They'd bring experience that the Chinese don't have. And I think the more you can draw Japan and China together, the better it may be. And the one or two meetings that President Xi and Prime Minister Abe have had seem to me, from a distance, to have lightened the atmosphere. But so far, it's only a toe in the water of better relations, but nonetheless, better that than the reverse.
Please join me to thank all those panelists, distinct panelists, for their insights.